You ever feel trapped? Like you're just treading water, waiting to drown?
Yes.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Lewis Fischer, and I am the guitarist from Australian death metal band Altars.
Now, Lewis, besides death metal, is there any other way you'd like to describe Altars or anything you'd want to add to death metal?
Yeah, well, I guess, I don't know, I find like just death metal is like a pretty good base description, but it doesn't really go very far to explain what exactly Altars is, because it is quite exploratory and a bit more on the experimental side. But I don't really tend to break it up further from there because it starts to become a little confusing for people. It's the kind of thing you need to listen to it and experience it, I think.
But as far as the exploratory and experimental side of your music, what form does that take?
Sorry, what form does that take?
Yeah, as far as when you say that Altars is experimental and exploratory. Are you referring to the dissonant parts or maybe some of the atmospheric elements in your music?
It's kind of all of the above. I mean, like my musical interests and background, like I sort of look to and take inspiration from a lot of things from sort of, I suppose, what you would say is outside the typical metal spectrum. I sometimes perform, solo improvised music or improvised music with other people. So sort of, I'm very much involved in, experimental music generally. And, with Altars, I guess I'm sort of trying to, I don't really think of it in terms of like being dissonant or in terms of being atmospheric, although it can be these things in parts. It's more, I'm trying to look to things outside, from like maybe jazz or classical, more modern classical type stuff, and then think about how I can sort of incorporate some of those ideas and thematic development into, a genre of music that's kind of, I suppose, relatively stuck in its way. So I'm sort of, I guess, trying to see how far I can push and even just break death metal a little bit, so it sort of starts to develop, but then also pull it back before it goes too far. So it's still, very much grounded in that, that sort of early 90s sound as well, which is also very important to me. So
you mentioned an interest in jazz and you mentioned improvisation. Is there a lot of improvisation in Altars, in either the recorded music or when you guys play live?
To a degree. I mean, typically when most of the guitar solos and stuff like that are generally improvisation. The track on the new record, Opening the Passage, the lead section was just straight up improvisation. Most of my ideas generally come from improvisation, whether that's just at home or, if we happen to be in a rehearsal room together, that tends to be kind of how ideas come about. And, those improvisations eventually turn into, riffs, it turn into more composed kind of forms, I suppose, if that makes sense. It's not like we don't have like extended improvisation sections. It can work in a metal perspective, but it's very hard to do as a three-piece where you're still trying to, I suppose, have the core of that song element there too. So
it sounds like a lot of the improvisation comes on the writing side from the writing part of your process.
Definitely.
Can you tell me a little bit about Altars' history and what your intentions were when the band first started?
Yeah, sure. So Cale, our now former bass player and vocalist, he and I sort of started the band together. I was about 17 at the time. So this is going back a long, long way. And basically we had met because we were kind of playing in, another band together at the time. Nothing serious, I was still in high school and we wanted to do a death metal thing. And that was kind of the direction we were both going and like sort of interested in at the time. And we've had and still have like a lot of common musical interests. Eventually, we recorded a demo and got that out and then kind of, went from there. In the beginning, music was probably a little bit more straightforward, Morbid Angel worship type stuff. And, we were still sort of discovering our sound and what on earth it was. But even like back then, there were, sort of elements of other stuff, sort of, I suppose the two bands that, from within metal that have always been very important to me, Morbid Angel and then Gorguts. So I kind of, as a youngster, sort of saw my style developing as something like if you took Luke LeMay and Trey and like smashed them together, maybe like that can be my sound. That's the kind of thing I would try and go for. Nowadays it's like obviously grown a heck of a lot since then and it's much more my own thing. But, that's sort of where it started and grew from, I guess. We released some splits and stuff like that and then eventually recorded Paramnesia, which did very well. And that was probably around the first time, I think, you know, by this stage I was in my early 20s, and I felt like I'd really finally found the sort of thing I'd been trying to achieve with that. The album did very well. It's kind of weird, actually, because the album is probably better known now than it was back then. It kind of grew into like, you know, here's this weird album you might have missed from 2013 kind of a deal. But yeah, in terms of from then to now, we basically had to put things on ice a number of years ago now because Cal struggles with a pretty serious mental illness, and we basically couldn't continue the band. So I went and did a bunch of other things in the interim, playing another band called Ignivimus, which is more straight up incantation-esque kind of school of death metal. But Altars was sort of something I really wanted to do again, and managed to get a hold of Brendan and get him on board, who was sort of, you know, the ideal replacement. At the time, I didn't really feel like it was going to be possible to replace Cal. So the obvious choice for me at that time was to bring things to an end and see what comes next. And now we're here with Ascetic Reflection.
So we'll get to Brendan and how he ended up joining Altars in a little bit. Going back to Paramnesia, when Paramnesia came out, I think people were starting to recognize more what was happening in Australia and New Zealand as far as the death metal scene. Portal had become very, very popular and very, very influential, and Ulcerate was also getting a lot of attention. Did some of that attention bleed on to Altars? Were people starting to notice you guys in the same way?
Maybe. You know, look, Portal and Ulcerate are like two, you know, these days they are extremely big. We've played with both bands before, and I think it was funny because we were like basically a new band in the sense that within Australia, the scene is relatively small, and you've got a lot of the same people playing in similar bands, and, you know, older dudes who've been doing it for, you know, a million years. And we were like fresh blood to that kind of scene. I live in Melbourne now, but I grew up in Adelaide, and the scene there is even smaller than it is in a lot of other places like Melbourne, which is, you know, a pretty, I don't want to use the term art capital, but it's that kind of thing. It's, you know, it's got all the hallmarks of that kind of a city where it's got a very lively music scene, and, you know, you can see about
Metropolitan, maybe?
Yeah, Adelaide's sort of like a much smaller city, so it's just doesn't have, you know, the critical mass of people doing art and making music. So yeah, so when we kind of came about, I guess it was refreshing for people. But also I did find, like, sort of after we released Paramnesia, it kind of like, yeah, it was on the verge of this kind of like gateway of stuff just sort of that started flowing out of Australia, and a lot more bands were starting to gain recognition, and like newer, younger bands grabbing attention and getting signed and stuff like that, which was really, really exciting to see. And, you know, obviously Portal and Ulcer have been very successful and have continued to grow to this day. So I think now, compared to, like, say, when we first started, Australian extreme music is just sort of a bit more understood and recognised on a global scale than it has been previously. So yeah, it's a positive thing.
And I should point out that the bands that you cited as influences, Morbid Angel and Gorguts, are foundational death metal bands. It's not like you guys were part of something new that was starting up when you put out Paramnesia. Your influences were, you know, very much from the early years of death metal. Yeah, well, I guess, you know, when I think about those bands, I don't really like think about them and says, oh yeah, I'm going to write like a Morbid Angel riff, or I'm going to write a more Gorguts riff or something like that. I kind of like, they're influential to me in the sense that, at least nowadays, as like an adult man who's, you know, lived some shit
and, understands things a bit better. They're influential to me in the sense that they weren't like, they weren't like ripping off other bands or like being a carbon clone of something. They were like finding their own sound and like creating their own language, and sort of that sort of inspired me to like, how do I invent my own language? And our music's pretty weird at times, and this is not like an easy path to take or choose to do. You could just play typical foundational style death metal riffs and everyone would love it, and that's great, but there's heaps of bands doing that kind of thing, and I was more interested in doing my own thing and trying to create something new and to advance the culture forward again a little bit. So we obviously weren't part of the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, but when Paramnesia came out, it was kind of a weird time because it kind of felt like there was a similar thing happening in a few places with, I guess, what people refer to now as like dissonant death metal. I don't know that terminology or like is necessarily accurate for like that's another discussion altogether. But like, I suppose what people typically refer to as sort of like this dissonant death metal thing, or post-death, if you will. People make up all sorts of names for this kind of a thing. There was kind of like a weird period of like bands very separately and very independently from all sorts of corners of the globe kind of tapping into something a little bit new at that point in time. And we were sort of a part of that. But, how you describe that is, a lot of people will make up their own kind of terminology for.
Now, when you say that you were a part of that, were you a part of that consciously? Or was it something that you recognized after the fact, that there were these bands from different parts of the world that were doing something similar?
It was something I sort of realized maybe more after the fact. It wasn't something I was sort of necessarily consciously aware of at the time. We were just making an album, we put it out, and we were just trying to do something a little bit different. And then, another album came out, and, this band's from Canada, this band's from, wherever. And it's like, oh, hang on, that's kind of interesting. And then like people started using the term dissonant death metal, which I have no idea when and where that term came from, but it was probably that early 2010s. It kind of came more into like the lexicon, I suppose. Someone probably knows the correct answer to that, but I don't really recall it being, a thing that people talked about prior to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned Gorguts. When Gorguts put out Obscura, and I was pretty young, so I can't say that I had a huge knowledge of like every single death or black metal band that was coming out at the time. But it was hard to find death metal bands that were doing something similar to what Gorguts did on Obscura, as much as what was happening kind of in the hardcore scene with bands like Coalesce, who were doing these very jagged rhythms and these, discordant parts and these unorthodox time signatures. And I think, I probably around the time All Straight put out their third album, people were starting to see threads, and, Portal was part of that as well. I know there were a couple of bands that were doing this kind of incantation worship, and that kind of fed into that style as well. And so I think, without their consciously wanting to or ever being a scene, like people started grouping a lot of things together that had a similar aesthetic.
Yeah. I think that period for death metal was just like really vibrant. And I think maybe we're heading into another one of those periods now, because the quality of releases coming out like just at the moment is sort of insane. I'm still like trying to catch up on a lot of stuff I've missed, just because like I haven't been recording for a little bit now. We finished that several months ago, but when I am writing and recording, like I tend to avoid listening to like a lot of metal stuff so that my thinking can be a little bit more clear. But there's so many releases that have come out in like the last 6 months that are fantastic. So I don't know, maybe we're heading into another hotbed period of, things being churned up again. But, certainly Gorguts, when they released Obscura, it took things to a whole new level. And that album is just insane. It's a long-time favorite of mine. But, if another band tried to do something like that just sounded like exactly like Obscura, it would be ridiculous. It would just be absurd because, like, I don't know, maybe it'd be really good. They did it really well. Like, I really like the band Cathilist, and that's like, they've sort of become their own thing, but, they kind of started out as just like a Demolic worship thing. But I love that because it's, obviously Demolic never released anything like another studio album other than Nesbeath and Nesbeath rules. And I just love that they're doing it, and they're such good musicians as well. So it's sort of like, that's fun for me because it's sort of like, oh yeah, what if like Demolic actually just like kept making records? This is like, let's live this alternate reality for a little bit where that's a thing. But yeah, certainly had a huge just impact generally. And you did hear that, in other genres of music too, and like whether consciously or not, things over time sometimes just get a little bit weirder, and that's a good thing, I think. It pushes everything forward. Everyone's pushing everyone and each other forward a little bit, and that's how music develops over time.
Now, you mentioned wanting to develop your own language musically as far as the way you play in altars. Was that something that you're conscious about even prior to Paramnesia, or is it something that you've been working on more recently?
I think it's something I've always been very conscious of, but like how well I was able to realize that as an individual has probably grown and developed. Like I'm probably a much better songwriter now. And then, it probably isn't until, Paramnesia was mostly written in a rehearsal room where like I'd throw out some riffs I had and then we would like develop them together in the rehearsal room and be like, okay, this drum beat might work. And it's like, oh, this drum beat makes me feel like wanting to play this riff. So you kind of like realizing it as it happened. Ascetic Reflection was quite different because of just the global situation. And that was kind of like me alone in my apartment doing stuff and then eventually sharing that with everyone. But it's something I've always been conscious of. I think I've just gotten better at and like just understanding not necessarily music, but like just art generally and like having a better understanding and like perception of the world versus, being, someone in their late teens or something like that. You're still growing and developing. So, things change and your perspectives change and you absorb things and learn different ways of doing things.
So we talked about some of the newer bands that were coming out of Australia, playing in a similar style or maybe with a similar mentality. One of those bands was actually Convulsing, and Brendan from Convulsing is now part of Altars. How did you meet Brendan, and how did he become a full-time member of Altars?
So I sort of knew Brendan from his project Convulsing, and I knew that he was sort of like a long-time fan of Altars, and I could hear and tell how, Altars had actually influenced Convulsing. So, and he's talked about this before in various interviews and stuff like that, but there's a track on one of his records that's a tribute. I'd have to like double check which one it is. I think it's literally called Altered from memory, but I knew he liked the band, but like most importantly, he's just like an incredible musician, but not just an incredible musician, but he has like an incredible understanding of like just music and sound in a very eerily similar way to myself. And that we had like a pretty similar sort of like wavelength and connection in that regard. Throughout the writing period for this record, basically I live in Melbourne. I have done for about 8 years, and the band sort of started in Adelaide. And I had already written about half the record, and we hadn't really been able to jam yet at all. I'd sort of been chatting to Alan about like when we basically had long-term lockdowns and also border restrictions, which basically meant we couldn't get together at all, and I couldn't leave the house for like very long extended periods of time. So basically, once we were able to do so, I was going over to Adelaide and jamming with Alan. We kind of got through the first half, and then I think he came to Melbourne once and we jammed a bit. And then I was going back to Adelaide to jam, and we were kind of like reaching the pointy end of things where we really needed that third person in there. And because of the situation, it was just really hard to like tie someone down and get them on board, because it's not just that, obviously COVID-19, we're in the middle of a pandemic still, but within Australia, just like having the border closures and like me being like living 8 hours away was making it really complicated. I knew that Brendan had moved to Adelaide several years ago, and like we sort of joked about me moving back and us opening a recording studio together and stuff like that. So, half jokingly, but, I didn't end up moving back, but I actually got stuck in Adelaide because I was visiting with the intention of doing some rehearsals with Alan, and I ended up they closed the borders while I was over there. So I ended up getting stuck there for about 4 months. And that was around the time I contacted Brendan because I was like, I need to get this done. Like, I'm like, we're at the point I need someone else on board to like help just like push this over the edge and finish it. And I wanted to record that year. So I knew he'd be able to do it, not just do it, but do it extremely well, and also add that, bring his own element to the project. You know, in Altars, everyone writes their own parts, you know, and the guitars typically come first, but the guitar riffs are written in a way where there's like a lot of room left for everyone to do their thing. You know, I'm sort of like, sometimes I am writing like bass and drums and all of that in my head as well. But, you know, I'm allowing that space there for that to occur. And yeah, we were just at a point where we needed to get that third person on board and finalize it. As I said, I ended up basically stuck there for 4 months away from home. And it was around that time we got Brendan on board. He started jamming with us, and sort of from the first moment, it was like, yep, this is ideal. You know, his musical intelligence is sort of extremely high. We were sort of able to riff off each other, and he was able to bring his own sort of elements in. I was able to give him like a little bit of guidance, kind of like what was in my head, and he was basically able to like read my mind and turn that into exactly what everything wanted to be. So yeah, that kind of musical partnership is really hard to come by when you just gel with and kind of understand each other in that same way. And that was kind of why we stopped doing it, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to recreate what I had with Cale, but what I've created with Brendan has been, you know, pretty incredible in itself. And it's a similar kind of relationship. So yeah, that really helps. I hope that answers your question. I really rambled on.
No worries. So it sounds like what you're saying is that Brendan, not only just a peer and someone whose music you appreciated, happened to be living in Adelaide at the time that you were in Adelaide trying to finish up the album. And so for those reasons, he was a logical choice to join the band.
He was a logical choice, but also I don't think there's anyone else I could have really chosen. Like, it was logical and convenient in the fact that we could all be in the same place, if only for, you know, a portion of time. But it was logical in that, like, we were just on the same wavelength and kind of understand music in a very similar way. And as we've discovered, write music in a very similar way. So I don't think there's really anyone who would have been able to get on that same kind of wavelength, because it's just really rare. It's really rare, like, to find others who think and consider things about music in that same kind of a way. It's kind of, I don't know. It's weird, because at the end of the day, this is just, it's freaking death metal, right? But like, it's just like, this band is not like, is far from a typical death metal kind of setting. It's sort of the way things come about. They're almost fully realized and pulled from within some very weird part of the brain. And you know, that confuses some people, but you know, it's what makes this band work, and Brendan is just fully across that. So yeah, even had I had the option of getting anyone from anywhere in Australia, and there was, you know, no pandemic and there was no like logistical issues, it probably would have been him regardless every single day of the week, because he's about the only person I would have trusted to bring to the table what he has, and he's delivered in a very big way.
But to be clear, you had already started working on music for a new Altars album before Brendan got involved, right?
It was mostly written, yeah.
And you mentioned that you have also been working on another project in the interim between Paramnesia and now. Was there a conscious decision on your part that you were going to keep Altars going and that you wanted to put out a new album? And
yeah.
If so, what led to that decision?
Yeah, sure. I joined Ignivimus and was sort of helping them out with some stuff, and that was really fun. And that's like, one of those more, if you haven't heard Ignivimus, it's kind of like they came about at a sort of similar time to Dead Congregation, and it's kind of like a similar sort of sound, but from Australia, and doing that sort of more incantation-ish kind of a vibe thing. I was a fan of the band, and just I hadn't played music in a number of years. I'd been dabbling in some other stuff, but yeah, a friend asked me if I'd be interested in joining and touring with them and stuff. So I guess that kind of like reactivated that part of me a little bit to want to do Altars again, because I realized how much I missed it, and that I guess I had something left to offer, and that it was far from done. So yeah, I sort of started thinking about Altars again more seriously and how I might be able to make it work. And yeah, we got back from tour. We went to Europe and did Killtown Death Fest and stuff with Ignivimus. And I got back, and that was basically when I started writing again for Altars. I'd had some really cool conversations with like various people I met over there and my travels, who sort of knew Altars and wanted information. And I'd sort of already knew at that stage that I'd planned to do it, but sort of I hadn't had time to really spend time invested in it yet. And then we basically had the bushfires followed by the start of the pandemic, and I was just locked in my apartment / cave, so to speak. And, I spent a lot of time working on stuff and basically fleshing out what this idea for the next Altars record was that existed in my head at that time.
Now, was there an understanding between you and your drummer, Alan, that at some point you guys would pick up Altars again? Or did this happen after you got the itch again, so to speak, to make new music?
I started writing stuff. I'd probably written like the first half of the record at this stage. And I'd been like obsessively demoing everything. And so everything was really already quite polished and very fully formed. And, at this stage, there was no capacity for me to be able to be in a room with him. So, it just didn't come up because it wasn't physically possible. But then it was towards the end of, it might have been 2020, I think. It was looking like borders would reopen and allow us to possibly convene. So, that was when I initiated a conversation with him and sort of said, look, I'm going to come over, visit my family and stuff. I've got some stuff I've been working on. Do you want to hear it? And do you want to do another Altars record? And he had a pretty quick think about it and said, yeah, let's do this. And then, basically that sort of over like that New Year period, I was down there visiting, and we sort of got back into like a, rehearsing once a week kind of a deal. And during that period, and then I had to leave again. And, and then once I'd leave, I'd like work on more new stuff and until, we eventually got there, and that was basically it.
So let's talk about this album. It's called Ascetic Reflection, and it was released on the 8th of July through Everlasting Spew Records. We spoke about the musical language that you were developing for Altars, and also how you had basically started writing this album more or less on your own sometime during the pandemic. Is that all correct?
Yeah. Purely due to, I guess, the situation. There wasn't really any alternative to how that could have started. So, by the time we actually started working on things as a group together and, adding drums, adding the extra parts, that didn't come until a little bit later. So it gave us a pretty big head start because it meant, we still obviously took the songs, rehearsed them together and, added the drums and some parts I would have very specific ideas for the drums, how they might sound in certain parts or how a certain thematic part was meant to sound and develop. So, we were it's a bit easier with, a drummer working in a room together and you can kind of express those things a little bit better. And I'm terrible at programming drums. It's something I'm not really interested in doing either because I don't want to accidentally dictate how that should develop because, I always want Alan to basically add his element of chaos into the mixture. So that was kind of, I guess, how it developed from there. So, once we'd drums and the guitars was very much already kind of in place, the drums were added and developed, and then the bass was added and developed once we got Brendan in and the vocals, and we started working on the vocals and figuring that part out. So, but it was more out of necessity, but I also think it led to us being able to do this record in a much more efficient, fast kind of a way. It was a practical way to work, but it meant we could finish this album quite quickly, I think.
We discussed the musical language, the musical style that you've been developing for Altars. Would you say you've expanded that language at all when Paramnesia came out and leading into the writing for this album? And what would you say the difference is between those two releases?
Yeah, well, I really very consciously didn't want to just write the same album. There's also some things I don't like about Paramnesia as a record because I felt like I was still discovering what that sound was as I was doing it. So the back half of the record for me is optimal. The front half I'm still getting there and figuring out what it is I'm doing a little bit. And that's how I kind of reflected on it now. And a lot of people like the earlier songs too. And some people prefer, our more traditional sounding riffs and songs. So, it's weird, but something I really wanted to do with this record was, and this was something I'd thought about a long time ago and had sort of, Kayla and I had discussed as something where we saw it going. And that was like harmonic development in the music. And, it's not a thing that exists a lot in death metal. It's more it's a lot more present in music like black metal, but we're not really a black metal band at all, I don't think. But this was something where I saw there was a room for us to expand and grow. And I really wanted to kind of evolve the sound that was there and push it to another level. And this was one way I could do this. So, there were a number of things, but that was one of the things. And which sort of was a very conscious thing, but also, it became more realized as I was doing it and as we were working on the songs together.
And as, because this album was almost like everyone was added, chefs were added in stages, if you know what I mean. It started with you and then you started collaborating with Alan again, and then Brendan became involved later in the process. Did you see the songs taking shape or changing form as additional members started giving their input?
They started to sound more like how I imagine them in their head. And I suppose that's, I don't know, it's kind of like how do you quantifiably measure that? You can't really, like, I don't think there's a device that lets you do that. But yeah,
well, you mentioned the chaotic element that Alan brings to the music.
He can do.
So I'm wondering, if there's like, parts on this album that changed significantly or felt different once the other members.
I don't think they changed significantly. One song that I was very unsure about, and this was Opening the Passage, and I nearly cut this song from the record about 50,000 times. We really needed the bass there because the concept for this song, I'd sort of been working on it, and I'd worked on it with Alan. This was the ones that Alan and I had sort of tried to work on together in the jam room. And the rest of the songs, apart, Anhedonia was one of Brendan's riffs, and really wanted Brendan to have like a sort of a compositional contribution to the record. So Anhedonia was basically mostly Brendan and then me collaborating with Brendan to make that work. Opening the Passage was basically Alan and myself. It kind of came out of a jam, and then I took it away and did some stuff with it. And I wanted the song to be about the bass, the drums, and the vocals. And the guitar was going to be doing like a much more free-form thing in a completely different time signature. And that was kind of the idea for the song. And the leads were just going to be like, it kind of conceptually started out as like more of a jazz thing, but then it just diverged away from that completely and ended up like it was. Where that song really came alive, it was like, and this was why I really wanted to get Brendan on very urgently, was sort of like, it was that song. It was like, we need the bass and we need the vocals, because if we can't really play this song without bass there, and we can't really play it without the vocals there, we couldn't really develop it any further. Once, we had Brendan there playing bass and then adding vocals in, it just elevated that to a whole new level, which probably exceeded my expectations, especially the extremely dramatic shouted vocal part. I'd sort of spoken to Brendan about that particular sort of style of vocal. He knew exactly what I was talking about. And then but he sort of came up with that as a part, he developed these vocals on his own. And because by this stage, we'd gone through here's some starter ideas, and he'd, very much taken and run with it. And he started demoing some vocals over it. And it just all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, that's the song. That's what it's meant to be. And it had all fallen into place. It was just waiting for these missing pieces of the puzzle that hadn't been added yet. So the rest of the tracks, I kind of had a good idea of what they were meant to be like, and they didn't dramatically change necessarily. Adding the bass was really helpful, because then we were able to, there's a lot of room, and the way Altars works, there's meant to be this interplay between the bass and the drums and the guitar. It's kind of like this organismic thing that moves together as a unit, rather than just obituary riffs. It's just not that kind of thing. The riff isn't just the guitar. It's the combination of all of the elements together that fuse to be a living, breathing creature type of thing. And so once you had all those elements there, it really comes alive. And yeah, I mean, structurally the songs didn't really change at all. Working on Anhedonia together with Brendan was really fun, because I really wanted him to have a Brendan song on there. And this was a riff he had, and we were in the rehearsal room, and and he played it. I sort of said to him, "Do you have any riffs you want to get on this record? Because now's the time. We're running out of space." So, and he pulled that riff out, and I'm like, "Yeah, that'll work. That'll work very nicely." I wrote the sort of simpler joining sections, and he had the riffs at the end, and I sort of suggested doing the slow down, and we worked through that with Alan, and it all kind of came together very nicely. But otherwise, it's sort of, because like I literally demoing things for months with nothing else to like do and no other way to progress the project forward, I already had a very clear conception and idea about not only how the songs should sound and function, but also how they would be recorded. By the time we got to the studio, like I knew exactly what I would do with the guitar riff, because it's a 3-piece band, but you want it to sound like 5 or 6 people in a room. So the way we recorded the guitars when we were tracking the album, the guitar riff I would play one way live. I would separate that into separate parts that are multiple different parts playing on like different parts of the stereo field, because that was something I wanted to mess with and exploit. So I already had like done the work in that regard. So those other songs were like already very well advanced on that level. So they didn't change so much between the later stages of me demoing stuff and the actual final recording, because I'd already spent, 6 or 8 months demoing them.
The bass has a very strange place in death metal. A lot of times I'm not talking about Ultra's music, but in general, in the genre, a lot of times you can't actually hear the bass. It's kind of submerged in the mix, or it's occupying the same space as constant double bass drumming or down-tuned guitars, and a lot of times it just doubles what the guitar is playing. In Ultras, what would you say the role of the bass is?
Yeah, not that. That's something, Kale and I sort of tried to develop together, and like replacing that was like kind of hard. So, but Brendan sort of knew, so again, similar frame of mind, and was able to kind of like build on that and develop it a bit further again. So yeah, the bass is sometimes like counterpointing. So like the guitar might be doing one thing and then the bass might be doing another thing that plays against it. One of the first things he brought in was like, I think we were jamming Perverse Entity, and it was like the first time he played the song, and he just like straight up pulls out the bass line. He plays at towards the end of the song. I think he's like moving up in thirds. It might be fifths, I've forgotten. And it creates this kind of counter melody underneath, like just this like droning sort of noisy tritone I'm playing. So, there's this kind of trading of places where sometimes the bass is doing the melody, sometimes it's the guitar, sometimes it's the guitar and the drums locking in, sometimes it's the bass and the drums locking in. And sometimes like the drums are kind of like doing like a pseudo melody somewhere in there, and it's like the guitar or the bass locking in with the drums. So like there's kind of like this trading of places where we're each at various points in a song performing a different role and like kind of moving to different anchor points, so that the bass isn't like just this static replicant of like the guitar riff, because that's really dull and boring. There's a few bands that do it really well. It's way less common in death metal traditionally, although there's some amazing death metal bassists out there who obviously don't do that. But it's a lot more common in black metal genres, or at least, I don't know, probably the obvious example is Decibel Amiga. The bass work on their records is incredible. And the way it, moves about and counterpoints things and helps the music develop thematically over the course of a piece, that's kind of like the perfect example of like what a bass instrument can actually add to something. I think it's very underutilized generally. So that's a very important part of our music and something we, are very conscious of and try to do. And it's something, I intentionally don't try to overplay guitar riffs so that there's actual space for the bass to do its little performance, and so that the riff is, the amalgamation of all those parts together rather than just, power chords.
Can you tell me about some of the unorthodox instrumentation that you have on this album?
Yeah, sure. So when we got into the studio, I had a few ideas. We did some stuff with like bowed cymbal, played some slide guitar, which is like more of like I use the term slide guitar loosely. It was like more like noise rock guitar played with the slide. But then I have a collection of like some weird and wonderful things, like the Soma Labs Divinia, it's an electric acoustic instrument. It's got 2 strings and it's basically a neck with these neodymium magnets in it. So the entire neck of the instrument becomes the pickup. And you can play it through a guitar amp or anything like that. And you play it with like a cello bow or something like that. And I played that on a couple of bits. That was really fun to do and something I was, really looking forward to. And probably on our next record too, I'd like to experiment with like bringing in more stuff like that. I had some Tibetan bells I'd bought that I got Alan to use at the beginning of like the final track, which is more of like this, it's more of like an outro extension of opening the passage kind of a thing, sort of ties off the record nicely. So anything you hear on the album, we recorded live. There was no samples or anything like that. Also, I got Alan to use brushes for some sections, which was a real challenge for him. He's very much like a blast beat metal drummer, but he was able to adapt to them really well. And like, it's a very different way of playing, playing with brushes as opposed to sticks. But it was something, it was really about the timbre of the instrument I had in my head, and like it wasn't sticks for like specific parts. So that was something we had to try and navigate. It was a little bit tricky. I also used another Soma Labs instrument called the Ether. They market it as kind of like an anti-radio, but what it is basically it picks up electromagnetic fields and turns that into sound. So it's kind of like staticky noise, but it's kind of cool because you can like plug it into a field recorder and like go for a walk or catch a train and like detect all these weird electromagnetic fields around you that just like exist that we don't see because they're invisible. But
so these were like ambient field recordings that you added to the songs.
Yeah. So that was basically what I used that for. Apart from that, I think that is about it. The only other thing at the very start of the record, slouching towards Gomorrah, the sound you hear at the start is the last riff from Paramnesia on the track Ouroboros, played backwards at half speed via a tape machine and through an echo chamber. So it's like
a little bit of Ultras of Madness, right?
Sort of. It was more inspired by like the Canadian band Martyr, the tech death band.
Oh, yeah.
Dan Mongrain, who went on to play in Gorguts and stuff. Like, we're not really a tech death band. That's not really what we're going for. But I remember hearing their records as a kid, specifically Hopeless Hopes and then Warp Zone. And I always loved the way that Hopeless Hopes ends with the riff that's like the first riff on Warp Zone. So that was something I had sort of really wanted to do for an extremely long period of time. And it was funny, like when I showed Cale, because we sort of like kept chatting about like the album, the progress sort of throughout, the whole thing. And, he couldn't be involved in like a huge capacity, but I got him to record some vocals at home so we could use them for that first track, because I kind of wanted it to be this bridge between these two worlds. And he commented as well that he always imagined it would do the exact same thing. So it's kind of a funny way that it turned out. But you can't really tell, even if you play it backwards, just because like the recording is like being so manipulated, it's hard to tell that it's the riff, but it is that riff.
That's awesome. And it's awesome that you were able to get Cale on this album as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was really important to me. in an ideal world, we never would have stopped and would have released, I don't know, 5 albums by now or something. And I really wanted him to be involved. He's a good mate. And yeah, unfortunately, it's sort of like life has challenges, and, that's that. And he was really glad to be involved too. And yeah, he loves the record as well. So
Where did you guys end up recording this album?
So I went back to Adelaide, and basically Brendan and myself engineered the session ourselves. So Twin Earth Recording Studio in Adelaide, it's sort of like a little studio that's got like a very Steve Albini electrical audio kind of style setup, but on like a maybe smaller scale. It's got the same desk as electrical audio and like a lot of the same microphones. So short of going and recording it with Steve Albini in Chicago, Brendan and I sort of both interested in like recording and engineering, and sort of have our own sort of small practices that we do. And, we joked about doing a studio together before, and it kind of just made sense for us to handle it so we could do the whole thing in-house. And, I had a very specific sound in my head that I wanted. Sort of between, Brendan's expertise, my expertise, and our collective ears, and, obviously Alan's input as well, we basically, tracked the whole thing there. We had 7 days, so we tracked everything and just completely analog. And then, except with the computer as basically a glorified tape machine to capture the recording. And then from there, we ran out of time to complete a full mix. Like Brendan and I tried, doing a full analog mix down, but the desk in the studio hadn't really been used that way before. The way we were trying to route things out of the computer, back through the desk, through analog gear, then back into the computer. So we didn't end up using those files, but basically took the files that we captured from the mics and desk and tracked originally into Pro Tools. We then took those away, and then Brendan and I mixed those at our own studios. Brendan sort of took the first sort of go at it and sort of built up the sessions and whatnot, because I didn't have all my equipment there because I wasn't at home. I was, at my family, visiting them to basically do the recording. So once, he'd sort of taken the first run on it, we'd sort of been trading ideas back and forth, and he handed it on to me. Then I did some more. And then there was some very specific ideas I, wanted to add with tracks like Black Light. I basically wanted to destroy the song. I was writing that song during the bushfires we had over here towards the end of through 2019 and 2020. So it's sort of like that song was very representative of that. I was trying to capture that feeling, and I kind of wanted the song to kind of disintegrate into nothing before you're pummeled in the face by the title track off the record. And they kind of form this mirror, I suppose, in the dead center of the record, where they're kind of opposing views of the same situation. So thematically, that's sort of how that developed. And then audio wise, we had to really mess around to try and get that to work exactly how we wanted it to.
So Brendan, I think, has been handling all the mixing and mastering for Convulsing. You mentioned that this is an area that you've been wanting to get into. Are you doing a lot of engineering work and mixing work?
Yeah. I've done a few things, and sort of have my own setup as well. So because we don't live in the same town. This is doing our own project together was the first time we got to work together. So that was, that was good. And we actually have a very similar ethos and ideas in that regard too. So, we wanted to capture things in a very specific way. We went into the session and I already had everything kind of planned out, from which mics we were going to use and placement and stuff like that, to potential signal chains we might want to explore for various things, because I knew the kind of sound I wanted in my head and how the record was meant to sound. But it was too much for me to be performing as well as doing all of that at the same time. So it was good because basically Brendan and I were able to trade off like the responsibilities sort of 50-50. So, when I was playing, he was sort of on the desk doing that. And then when he was playing his bits, I was on the desk doing that. And then the mixing, we were kind of trading off and sending stuff back and forth. And then by the time we got to the mastering, I'm like, well, you can handle this, because I'm not personally very interested in mastering. By that stage of a record, I'm very ready to hand it off, but I've got like graphic design skills and background, so I was able to jump on that and do the layout for stuff.
You didn't do the engineering and mixing for Paramnesia, right? Or did you?
No. Paramnesia, we went to a different studio and used an engineer there. I developed probably an interest in engineering after doing that session. I learned a lot from it. So, yeah.
And in terms of the sound, was there anything specifically you wanted to do with this album differently from Paramnesia?
I wanted it to sound extremely organic and like it was sort of, this rich tapestry of, I don't know, like a plant that was like living and then like breathing and doing stuff. And like, I knew exactly with my guitars, I'm like very specific how like I want them. And it was nice because I could go in and be like, yes, I'm using my favorite mic setup and I'm placing them exactly this distance from the speaker cabinet, because this is like, it's very atypical for like a kind of like a death metal sound, but it's like my sound and like exactly how I know it's meant to sound. I know exactly how to get it. But if I knew that if I'd like had gone into another studio, there's no way an engineer would pull out those microphones and think this is going to work, because like they maybe don't realize what the band is and trying to do. And sort of similar with the drums, I sort of had like a very good idea. But yeah, it's weird. I don't think I've ever worked on a project where like I've thought at the end of it, that's exactly how it sounded in my head. But with this, I do. Like, people might like or not like the album. I don't really mind, open to criticism. But like, to me, like it's the perfectly realized vision of what I had in my head that whole time. I don't think I've ever gotten that close on anything. And I think the fact that we were engineering it ourselves and were able to like make those very calculated decisions, and the fact that like we did actually know what we were doing, like between Brendan and myself, yeah, we got there, and it's everything I think it was supposed to be. So it was a very satisfying process. It was a lot of work too, and could be quite stressful at times, but it was very much worth it.
So with the album out and the band back on track and things opening up COVID-wise, what's next for you? What do you guys have planned?
We are playing a bunch of shows. We were meant to play on the weekend, but unfortunately someone came to our show with COVID and gave it to us. So we had to postpone our Melbourne date. But this weekend we're playing in Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne. So we've got a postponed show on our regular Sydney and Canberra shows that will be able to happen because we'll be out of isolation. So after that, I'm not sure. It's kind of like a bit of a hectic year, and things are still, the world is in a constantly developing and changing situation, but hopefully we'll be able to get over to places like Europe and the US over the course of the next 12 months or so. I will have to see what happens. Obviously touring is pretty hard when you're from Australia. You're just a little bit further away from the main centers than others, so it's just a little bit harder. But if you'd like us to come and play Malaysia or wherever you might be listening from, just book us and we will come. That's kind of the deal. So yeah, if people
we'll make it happen, bro.
Exactly. That's really it. Yeah, we'd love to. It's always interesting going to different places, and I think it'd be great if more bands actually from Australia specifically played in places like Southeast Asia, because there's a lot of interesting music coming out of there, and obviously like the people and the culture is really interesting as well. So we're quite close neighbours, so it's people should probably do more of it. But hassle your local promoter. bring some bands down.
And what does the future look like for Altars? Second album? Are you thinking about the third one?
Very much so. We run a very DIY operation. I kind of like do most of the organizing myself. So I'm sort of like looking forward to a little bit of a break just after these shows are done, so that I can maybe start just playing guitar again. That would be nice. So yeah, in between, obviously we want to play lots of shows and go tour and promote this record, but I'm going to be starting sort of work on the next one. I've sort of been thinking about what that might look like, and I'm still kind of realizing that, but it's very much the plan to, hopefully follow up with another full length in an appropriate due amount of time.
Excellent. So Ascetic Reflection is out now through Everlasting Spew Records. Lewis, how can people order the album? What's the best way to get it?
If you're in Europe, you're best off heading to the Everlasting Spew website or Bandcamp. You can order through them. There are also copies available in the US via Night Shift merch and Indie merch store. You'll save a lot on shipping. You can also order from us directly in Australia. It costs a little bit more to ship from us because we're a long way away, but we're happy to sign stuff like that for you if that's the kind of thing you're wanting. Our Bandcamp is altarsdeath.bandcamp.com, and we do all of that through there. So,
and if people want to follow Altars online and find out more information about the upcoming Southeast Asian tour, what's the best way to do that?
I hope so. That'd be really fun, actually. On Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, it's always the handle altarsdeath. So pretty easy to find us there on any of those platforms. I'm mostly active on Instagram and Facebook, but we're open to trying new things. Also, obviously we're on Spotify as well.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No, thank you very much for having us. And I hope you enjoy the record.
Very cool. Thanks so much, Lewis.
No worries. Take care. Have a good day.